I definitely see. I love the ideas that you're sharing and that idea of connecting with those multiple intelligences. Um, One thing I think is really critical for me when I'm in a classroom is coming with my whole self. And I think that idea is kind of centered in this idea of mindfulness. And, coming here to William and Mary, I've been very mindful of the history that has been circumscribed upon my body, as a black male. Sitting at this table, sitting in this space, I'm very mindful that this space looked very different, years ago. And that mindfulness of the student that comes from China and comes to this space for the first time, that mindfulness of the student that has native blood, that mindfulness of that Latino student whose family is a first immigrant, that's a mindfulness. And those kind of things in terms of liberality, in terms of liberal arts, we get to explore all those different ideas and begin to embrace that full-bodiedness of the student, the full fleshiness of them. And as an artist, as a person who explores the material around us, that sees and sees differently, I think those things become really critical in helping one to see, whether it be through their body or them to see it through the material, or whether they see it through the exegesis of words, whether they see it through going through different theories. All these things are embodied within the world in which I operate in as an artist, as a creative. And when I say that mindfulness, I think back of an incident that took place from my first job out of grad school. And when I think you said about this idea of going to different schools, I went to a liberal arts school in terms of Xavier University of Louisiana, the only Black Catholic college in the Western Hemisphere. When I went, there was 2,500 students, and I went there on a basketball scholarship. So all these things kind of embodied in me. And I was the only art major on the basketball team, both male and female.
Wow.
So I went a whole different direction that they did. And they all went one way and I went another way. So I'm thinking about that. And then I go to Michigan State for grad school. And you're talking about that mindfulness, that going into the space, this gulf of people, 45, 50,000 people. I never saw the full campus my entire time there. And then I leave out of there. My very first job, of course, I wanted to be this college professor up in the Northern Virginia area, but there were no jobs in my area. So I ended up pursuing at the high school teaching job and ended up loving it. And what it was a critical moment in my life about that mindfulness is that was the moment that I truly began to love myself, to love the skin I'm in, to love my body, to love the history, even in the midst of growing up with mama on her knees on the end of bed praying that Steve returns home because of the way in which this world is constructed around me. That's a mindfulness. You see, I'm pushing the story all these different ways in terms of how one sees and how do we listen? How do we engage with our students? How do we see the fullness of them? Those things. And then I get into that classroom and I had the student named Spencer. I won't say his full name. Spencer gave me hell every day. And he would just making jokes over my stuff. I was kicking this kid out of class. Like, get out because you're disrupting. I can't teach. I can't teach. I can't teach. I can't teach. And finally I said, I got to figure this out. I can't keep throwing this kid out of class. And he came to class and he had this computer and he had it opened up and he was typing on some stuff. And I'm like, Spencer, we got to get ready for class. You got to put your computer away. Spencer, oh, okay, Mr. Prince, okay. I say, Spencer, you need to put it away now. Oh, okay, Mr. Prince, I got it. And then I went over to him. I went to close the computer on his hands. He said, no, I got to finish the program again. And I paused. And I said, okay, Spencer, finish it. Spencer finished it. He closed the computer. At the end of class, I said, Spencer, I need to see you at the end of class. I was teaching art appreciation. I walked him from that class all the way down to the sculpture class that I was teaching. He had no idea I was teaching this class. I walked him in there. I began to explain to him metallurgy. I explained to him the casting process that I was teaching down in that classroom. He got so fascinated. He said, oh man, I would love to learn this, Mr. Prince. And I said, thank you. I said, but I want to make an observation. I said, when you were in the classroom and you had that computer open and I was going to close that computer on your hands and just shut it down. I said, but I paused because I found out in that moment that was something important to you. And I said, I did not want to squat on it. I said, but what you do to me every single day, this is what's important to me, this subject, this art. And I want to share with all of my being, all of my heart to you. And you're squatting on it. And he looked at me. He said, I'm sorry, Mr. Prince. He said, I want to take this class. I said, Spence, I don't know if I ever want to see you again. I was honest.
Yeah.
I was completely honest with it. And I said, Spencer, if you give me a different attitude going forward from this day and knowing this is something that's important to me and that I was able to stop and see what was important to you, then perhaps we can see each other, we can meet each other, and perhaps there could be growth and there could be something magical can happen in this room if we stop and we pause. Those kind of moments, it requires us to slow down, to see, to listen, to hear with our full being. That's what teaching is.
And what I'm hearing in that is something that I certainly never learned when I was being trained to teach, which is that for us now, the being of the student and reaching each student, making a kind of personal connection with each student is something I think that younger generations of teachers are more used to thinking in that way. So I'm wondering whether other people around the table, have reflections on what Steve's just said and on how you were trained to teach and how you bring that kind of sensibility into your teaching practice. Abby?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. One of the tools I found, it's from the Abolitionist Teaching Network. They have a social emotional questionnaire that is really helpful at the beginning of a semester. It can be a great way for a student to communicate any needs that they have, things that they're not interested in saying in front of other students, things that might not be showing up on their accommodations forms. You are able to communicate how they learn best. And then the last question, which I really like, is what do you care about most? And then in the parentheses, it's like in your family, in the world, just amongst your friends. And so there's a humanness that is prioritized there. And so that's one avenue when I'm starting out. And then coming to the space as an acting professor, when you're talking about being a whole person as a teacher, that deeply resonates with me. A lot of our students come into spaces and they have been sitting up here all day long. They have tension in their shoulders and they're really comfortable with communicating from the shoulders up. And it is fascinating doing movement exercises and vocal explorations that allow them to be themselves more authentically and in a more grounded place from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester. There's this incredible transformation, and they get to know each other. They form an ensemble over the course of the semester, and I get to be, people were talking earlier about being the guide on the side. I very much feel like a facilitator in that. At the end of class today, students, I was like, what are they doing? They're all bunched up, and they were just like pushing their iPhones together so that they could share their contact information. I was like, heck yeah. All right, cool. We have an ensemble. We're doing it. But you can't force that. A lot of that comes from time, from breath, from exercises together, and from being present with your whole self. I use a questionnaire only very recently I started using a questionnaire for the first day of class. And I always ask them, are you comfortable being cold called in class, or do you want me never to cold call you? And I don't care if you don't, it's up to you how you learn, if you want to learn by listening. And the really interesting thing about that questionnaire is, so I ask them and I take in all the questionnaires and then I have to write down all the names of the students I'm not allowed to call on, because obviously it would be horrible if I asked them. It's a very bad thing. Surprise.
But the totally weird thing is that usually the most talkative students in the class are the ones who said they didn't want to be called on. And I've told them I won't call on you. And it seems to have this sort of weirdly freeing impact on them.